Great. I do have a handout that will encapsulate some of the things I'm going to talk about, and my daughter Catherine will go around and hand it out. We have over 100 copies, so that should be enough. While she's doing that, I just want to say it's been a great blessing for our family to be part of this church, and through the leadership of the elders and deacons here, and especially the senior pastor and the associate pastor. And so it's, I guess, a mutual admiration society. It's also a great privilege to have met in person Vishal Mangalwadi, who I, back when I was a college professor, would assign some of his books. And I was actually very positively influenced by some of the things that he wrote in India, the Grand Experiment, and some of his other books, including the one on William Carey, which I would highly recommend, that he talked about this morning. Having said that, if you were here last night, you know that I have a bit of a disagreement with him on one particular point, and since that's been brought up today a couple times quite passionately, I decided that I'm still going to give my main talk, but I thought I'd just briefly sort of articulate my respectful disagreement. Heard a fairly passionate condemnation of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, and on the idea of general revelation. I just want to point out that from my perspective, pretty much the universal teaching of the church, going back to the Old Testament, New Testament, Augustine, through the medieval scholastics like Aquinas, through the Reformation, Luther and Calvin, all pretty much uniformly agreed that God reveals himself primarily through two ways. One, of course, the most important, is the Bible. No question about that. But they also thought that God reveals himself more generally, even to people who don't have access to the Bible or initially don't accept the Bible, and that's through reason, nature, conscience. And that generally has been known as general revelation. And from the Christian standpoint, they hang together. They're not separately. Reason is not autonomous human reason. They both point to the same truth. And if they don't, or if some people is claiming that, say, some Christian doctrine is anti-reason, then there's something out of kilter with how you are understanding reason. And so, but that was still a very important teaching. And so when we get to the words of the Declaration of Independence saying all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator, and that those with certain unalienable rights, and that these rights, your understanding is self-evident, I just want to point out that at the time of the founding, and the reason why, say, Presbyterian minister John Witherspoon, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, the reason he could sign it is because the way the founders understood that, and lay people and ministers, is that both the Bible and human reason actually properly understood point to the same truths. And so when they said self-evident, I also want to clarify that. Self-evident doesn't mean, and did not mean to them, that no one can misunderstand it or that everyone can always understand it. In the same way that, to say that true Christian doctrine is human equality doesn't mean that every Christian has ever believed in that. In this country we had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Christians who believed in chattel slavery over many decades. They were wrong, but my point is, self-evident really meant that you cannot rightfully reject that if you really understand reality. And so I do think when saying that idea that the American Revolution led to the French Revolution, I think historically happens to be wrong. I'd say that if you want more ideas on sort of a counter view to what you got on that, my book, The Politics of Revelation and Reason, would be a good place to start. With all due respect to George Marsden and Mark Knoll, both of whom I think, especially if you read Mark Knoll's new edition of his Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, you will see that he has a lot of cultural, secularist baggage that drive him to say some of the things that he said. Now, why does this matter? Why am the reason I'm making this point about general revelation is because I think it's actually really important. I agree completely with the critique we heard about the dangers of how Christians gave up the educational system, how they handed it over to secularists, and how the churches should take that on. And so I agree with everything that Vishal said about that. But what I want to point out is that it was at the time that Christians, I would argue, had a vibrant defense of general revelation, by which all I mean is that there is a common ground. Because we're created in the image of God, there is, through conscience, through reason, through our understanding of nature, there is a common ground that we have with people even who aren't Christians. That when Christians really believed in that, that's actually when they were arguing against slavery, when the temperance movement, many of the other things that you're talking about. It was after the Christians sort of went into their cocoon and said, it's going to just be the Bible alone. And actually, what they were saying, I would say it was defeatist, because they were saying that when Darwin came along, these secular philosophers, they were basically ceding ground and said, well, yeah, you're right. The Bible, it can't be defended on reasonable grounds, or can't be this. And so we're just going to refuge in, we believe in the Bible no matter what reason says. The earlier Christians said, no way, if you're making arguments against the Bible, that those are unreasonable, that you're using bad reason, your arguments don't work. And then, but when you change to, well, we don't even have to defend things, that's one reason why today I think that feeds into the cult of just the Bible being just a story, or that apologetics isn't important, or that all those things, I think, flow from not recognizing that there is a legitimate role for general revelation. So that's all I had to say on that. I actually do agree with Vishal on many things, but on that particular point, I don't have to. Now, happen to. In any case, but I still, great admiration to, I mean, he, I think, is one of the great heroes of Christianity in the last several decades, from his work for human rights and his pointing towards human dignity debate and the transforming power of the Bible, which I'm now going to switch to because I'm going to talk a little bit about how that played out in the area of science. So, the influence of the Bible can be found, I'd argue, in every nook and cranny of our culture, sometimes in the unlikeliest of places. I did my undergrad work at the University of Washington in Seattle, a very big, very secular school that was pretty hostile to Orthodox Christians when I attended, and is even worse now. But one day I made a discovery that surprised me. The university's official motto consists of the Latin words lux sit. The motto was chosen by the university's first president, Asa Mercer, in the 1860s. Mercer apparently thought it was the phrase, Latin phrase for let there be light, the majestic declaration by God during the creation account of Genesis 1. Now, current scholars say that Mercer must not have been very proficient in Latin, because a far better phrase that for let there be light is fiat lux. But I think we should be charitable, given that Mercer was appointed president of the University of Washington at the ripe old age of 22, being the only person in Seattle at the time who had graduated from college. In any case, the biblical phrase, let there be light, has been used by a number of educational institutions as a motto, not just the UW. At its best, it symbolizes a recognition that true knowledge does arise from illumination from God. Nowhere has this truth been more relevant, I think, than in the rise and advance of science. As I'm going to argue this afternoon, the light of the Bible helped give rise to modern science. Now, you might not know that if you were educated in America in recent decades, or even before then. That's because for more than a century, many in our society, especially among the elites, have pushed a narrative that Christianity and the Bible were somehow obstacles to the rise of science. In its most extreme form, their view of history runs something like this. After the end of the Roman Empire, Christianity plunged the world into the dark ages of superstition and tyranny. The progress of science stopped. The progress of technology stopped. Dogma ruled, scientists were burned at the stake. There was war between science and religion. The world stayed in the Dark Ages right up until the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, when thinkers rebelled against theocracy and proclaimed man as the measure of all things, giving birth to the scientific revolution in an age of perpetual progress. This narrative is sometimes known as the warfare or conflict thesis, the claim that Christianity, going back to the so-called Dark Ages, has been perpetually at war with science and impeded its progress. The warfare thesis is pretty much complete claptrap, but it's damaging claptrap, and even though historians no longer take it seriously, you will still find it popping up in pop culture all the time. I'd like to respond to the warfare thesis by making 3 key points. First, the Middle Ages as a whole really weren't dark ages. The period was actually a time of great human progress in both the arts and sciences. It was during the Middle Ages that we saw the invention of eyeglasses, I'm using right now, the printing press, mechanical clocks, the extensive development of wind and water power, the wheelbarrow, crop rotation, Gothic architecture, chimneys, horseshoes, blast furnaces, paper mills, more elaborate compasses, polyphonic music, the development of universities. The list goes on and on. With regard to science in particular, one scholarly book claims, quote, the scientists of the 12th century were daring, original, inventive, and above all determined to discover rational explanations of natural phenomena. Their intense interest in the natural world for its own sake, their habits of precise observation, and the high value they placed on man as a rational being portended a new age in the history of scientific thought, unquote. So far from demonstrating the stopping of scientific, technological, intellectual progress, the Middle Ages were in fact a seedbed of progress. Interestingly, C.S. Lewis was one of the early scholars who debunked the myth that the Middle Ages were just the Dark Ages. Second reason that the warfare thesis is wrong is that the Christian church did not actually oppose the rise of modern science, either in the Middle Ages or during the Renaissance and so-called Enlightenment. But wait, you might say, didn't Christians hold back science by championing a flat earth? Didn't Columbus face opposition to his famous voyage of 1492 because they thought he was going to fall off the face of the flat earth? No, he didn't. The whole story about Christians resisting or insisting on a flat earth is pretty much a hoax, primarily propagated after Darwin by polemicists who were trying to promote the warfare thesis. And if you'd like to learn more about the history of this myth, I'd suggest reading a book by a really good historian. It's called Inventing the Flat Earth by historian Jeffrey Burton Russell, who goes into some amount of depth of how that myth of the Christians believing the flat earth were sort of opposing the rise of science and opposing Columbus is just that, a myth. Of course, there's also the story of the persecution of Galileo, except it turns out that Galileo's problems were a lot more complicated than usually portrayed, and he antagonized not just clergy, but the scientists and other intellectuals of his day. So the Galileo story is not really a story about so much his conflict with the theology of the Catholic Church. In any case, as a general rule, even if it was, as a general rule, Christianity did not thwart the rise of science. Third reason the warfare thesis is wrong is that far from opposing science, most of the leading scientists of what became known as the scientific revolution, starting in the 16th century, were actually devout Christians whose biblical worldview supplied a rationale for their science. Now, this is the point I want to unpack in the rest of my talk. To do that, I first need to go back to the opening of the book of Genesis, which declares, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, many of us who've grown up in modern Western culture take this biblical account of creation for granted. You shouldn't. We shouldn't. For much of human history, and in many different cultures, people did not believe that nature is the result of the wisdom and purpose of an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful creator. One of the best ways to understand the uniqueness of the biblical account is to read creation accounts from other cultures. In many of these accounts, the creation of the world is the result of accident and evil, not wisdom and foresight. In a Polynesian account, for example, a creeping plant withers and rots. Out of the rot springs worms. Out of the worms spring us. Or take a Babylonian account where creation is the result of the gods killing their mother, plunging a spear into her and bursting her belly and severing her inward parts and clubbing her and smashing her skull. Okay? By contrast, the biblical account depicts creation as orderly and good. God declares his plans beforehand and then brings them into existence. Throughout the Bible, the original creation is seen as reflecting God's wisdom and power and goodness, not chaos and confusion and evil. In Psalm 19, David proclaims that the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. In his letter to the Romans, St. Paul writes that since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, from the creation, so that people are without excuse. This biblical belief that nature reflects the wisdom and order of a wise creator was amplified time and again by other Jewish and Christian writers, outside the canon. In the Book of Wisdom, written perhaps as early as the 1st century BC, the Jewish author argued that God has arranged all things by measure and number and weight, suggesting that nature embodies a rational, even mathematical order created by God. And early scientists cited that, actually. In the Book of Wisdom also writes that from the greatness and beauty of created things come a corresponding perception of their creator, so that we can, from the created things, we can actually see a reflection of their creator. But moving ahead to the early centuries of the Christian church, in the 2nd century AD, there was a Christian bishop of Antioch known as Theophilus, and he wrote an extended discourse on how the regularities and orders found throughout nature, not just in the skies, but in today what we call ecosystems, all testify to nature's designer. This biblical belief, and then early Christian belief, that nature reflects the wisdom of a master creator supplied a powerful foundation for the development of modern science. If a supremely wise God created nature, we can expect nature to reflect his intelligent design, to act in orderly and rational ways that we as rational creatures can comprehend. Accordingly, early scientists thought they could unravel the mysteries of nature because of that. And it's precisely because they thought nature was the product of God's intelligent design that they expected nature to be orderly, purposeful, governed by laws rather than chaos, and understandable through human reason. And this expectation fueled the rise of natural science as we know it. C.S. Lewis put it succinctly in his book Miracles. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. Now, there was a companion belief to the intelligent design of nature that also encouraged the rise of science. And this is going to sound similar to something I just said at the very beginning. This was the idea that God revealed himself to humans in 2 key ways: through his written word, the Bible, and through the workings of nature, his creation. We see this idea already in Psalm 19, which starts out by talking about God declaring himself and showing himself through the heavens, through nature, declaring the glory of God. But then it switches mid-psalm to talking about the beauties of the law of the Lord, God's written word that reveals his laws. Implicit in Psalm 19 is the idea that there are actually 2 books God provided for us to know him, the Bible and the so-called book of nature, his creation. So if we want to understand God fully, we should study both. The idea that we should study the book of nature to find out what God reveals through his works became an encouragement for scientific investigation. You can see the development of this kind of thinking during the Reformation in the Belgic Confession of 1561, which explicitly states in Article 2 that God has given us 2 books to know him by, his holy and divine word, the scriptures, which are absolutely authoritative, absolutely true, and, quote, the most elegant book of the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, wherein all creatures, great and small, are as so many characters leading us to contemplate the invisible things of God. Then a little later than that, Francis Bacon, often considered one of the founders of modern science, further solidified this idea in his book, The Advancement of Learning, in 1605, a few decades after the Belgic Confession. He said that Jesus has put before us 2 books or volumes to study if we will be secured from error. First, the scriptures revealing the will of God, and then the creatures he created, in other words, the creation. Bacon warned that no one should think that a man can search too far or be too well studied in the book of God's word, the Bible, or in the book of God's works, again, creation. The late sociologist Rodney Stark, who was one of many scholars who documented the connection between biblical theism and the rise of modern science, wrote about this in chapter 2 of his book, For the Glory of God, which I think was mentioned earlier by Vishal. Stark contends, quote, not only that there is no conflict between religion and science, but that Christian theology was essential for the rise of science, unquote. Now, other historians of science aren't quite so emphatic, but they also emphasize how Christianity, grounded in the Bible, provided a fertile ground for science to grow. In the words of historian Peter Harrison, the Bible played a significant role in the scientific revolution and influenced the emergence of modern science in a variety of ways. Now, I want to say a little bit of caveat here. Historians of science have a lot of different views about how influential or not The Bible in general and Christianity in particular were to the rise of science. Certainly other monotheistic traditions drawing from the Bible were also influential along with Christianity. Islam made many contributions to the rise of science and technology in the Middle Ages. Jewish scientists have made incredible contributions to the history of science. The ancient Greeks and Romans, who were not biblical, informed, played a role, especially those who believed in the intelligent design of nature. Outside of Western monotheism, various Asian cultures like China and in India contributed to the development of science and technology as well. So I'm not trying to argue here for Rodney Stark's maximalist position that biblical theism in the form of Christianity was the only way you can have modern science. Maybe true, maybe not, but that's not my main point, because I think that gets into the weeds. What I am staking out is a more limited position that basically says biblical theism was not an obstacle to the rise of science. I think that's clear. Most secular historians will admit that. Two, biblical theism provided a logical rationale for science, and I've tried to explain that here. And three, more practically, very personally speaking, for many early scientific pioneers, biblical theism provided a positive personal motivation for science. That's why modern natural science has its roots in the Christian Middle Ages, and why, in the words of Rodney Stark, the leading scientific figures in the 16th and 17th centuries overwhelmingly were devout Christians who believed it their duty to comprehend God's handiwork. You can see the theological motivation for science that Stark is talking about in countless leaders of the scientific revolution. You can see, for example, in the works of polymath Sir Isaac Newton, who declared in his Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy in 1687, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets, found in our solar system, basically, could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. You can see the theological motivation for science in English naturalist John Ray, whose book, The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation, 1691, is dedicated to showing how each part of nature reflects, as he said, the infinite power and wisdom of God, the Creator. In the words of Ray, the vast multitude of creatures, and those not only small but immensely great, the sun and the moon and all the heavenly hosts are effects and proofs of his almighty power. The admirable contrivance of all and each of them, the adapting of all parts of the plants to their several uses, the provision that is made for their sustenance, and lastly, the mutual subserviency to each other, how they work together, and the unanimous conspiring to promote and carry on the public good are evident demonstrations of his sovereign wisdom. One final example from the scientific revolution, English chemist Robert Boyle, who lived from 1627 to 1691, one of the founders, regarded today, of modern chemistry, he wrote that the wise author of nature has so excellently contrived the universe that the more clearly and particularly we discern its intricate construction, the more plainly we discern the admirable wisdom of the omniscient author of things. In his last will and testament, Boyle sent a message to his scientific colleagues in Britain's Royal Society, wishing them a most happy success in their attempt to discover the true nature of the works of God. That's how he regarded nature. And praying that they and all other searchers into physical truths, scientists, may cordially refer their attainments to the glory of the author of nature and the benefit of mankind. So he was actually saying the goal of science, twofold, benefit of mankind, but first of all, to the glory of God. For Boyle and many other early scientists, the ultimate purpose of science was indeed the glory of God. Now, Rodney Stark studied the beliefs of 52 of what he called the early scientific stars who lived from 1543 to 1680. These were pioneering scientists who made some of the biggest contributions to the early scientific revolution. Over 3/5 of them, 60%, he classified not just as conventionally religious, but as devoutly religious, devoutly Christian, from their private and public writings. They really were devout in their belief in the Christian God. Another 1/3 of these scientific stars of the scientific revolution were conventionally religious. They went through the motions. We don't know how personally they took it. Only 3.8% of these people could be considered sort of religious skeptics. The biblical belief that nature displayed the intelligent design of a creator was the dominant view during the birth of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries, and it helped modern science develop. But that was then, this is now. What about today? Does the biblical idea that nature reflects the intelligent design of an all-wise creator still have any relevance to the practice of science? I would argue that it does. Even today, and this is an absolutely critical point, if you don't remember anything else, remember this, even today, scientific investigation proceeds because scientists assume for the sake of their research that what they're studying is orderly and reflects a rational purpose. In other words, scientists have to treat what they're studying as if it was intelligently designed in order to understand it. So when scientists look at a molecular machine like ATP synthase, the power plant of the cell, or the walking kinesin motor that transports molecular cargo inside your cells right now, or the bacterial flagellum, the rotary motor that helps bacteria move. When scientists study these amazing molecular machines inside us, they treat them as systems where all the pieces work together for a purpose. In other words, they have to treat them as if they were engineered, as if they were designed. That's why they think they can understand them. In fact, they sometimes talk about reverse engineering a system. This is the essence of much scientific investigation. We treat things as designed so we can understand them, and this is why a belief in intelligent design is not a science stopper, not irrelevant, not just philosophical, it's a science starter, even for those who say otherwise. I came to appreciate this truth many years ago when I had a discussion with someone who's now a friend of mine, Professor Scott Minnick, a microbiologist at the University of Idaho. Minnick told me how he was attracted to the idea that there was intelligent design throughout nature because he found it so much more consistent with how he actually had to pursue science in the lab. To understand how a certain biological system works, he and his colleagues would assume that that biological system under study was designed to fulfill a particular purpose. They further assumed that each of the parts of the system played a helpful role in achieving the system's overall purpose. They did not treat the system under study as something cobbled together haphazardly or whose parts may be useless. In other words, these scientists treated the biological systems they were studying as if they were intelligently designed, and this assumption of design guided their investigations. The reality is that intelligent design is a guiding assumption for scientific research right now, even for those scientists who claim not to believe in it. Unfortunately, during the past 150, 160 years, this foundational truth on which modern science rests, that nature is intelligible and studyable because it was designed, has become obscured, largely due to the work of Charles Darwin. Darwin's main claim isn't that the history of life was a long time. We can debate that. But Darwin claimed, his most radical claim, was that the appearance of design in nature was an illusion produced by an unguided process driven by random and accidental variations in nature. In his words, there seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings, so the different kinds of organisms, and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. So again, he thought design was an illusion and that you could have unguided processes that produced this illusion without really needing the real design. Although touted as a great breakthrough for science, the reality is that Darwin's theory has repeatedly held back science by encouraging scientists to dismiss anything they can't understand as the useless leftovers of the blind evolutionary process. I would go so far as to say, insofar as scientists are bad Darwinians, that they actually believe that things were designed for a purpose, science proceeds. Insofar as they take Darwin seriously in guiding their research, well, we get things like science, again, I'm going to give you some examples, but they think that they dismiss anything they can't understand as a useless leftover of this blind evolutionary process. Science, though, is based on the idea that nature and her workings reflect a rational design. Again, Darwin tried to undermine that idea, and science suffered. In his book, The Discarded Image, which we've heard about earlier today, C.S. Lewis wrote that nature gives most of her evidence in answer to the questions we ask her. I think that is a very profound comment if you think about it. The answers we receive from nature are dictated by the questions we ask, and the questions we ask are shaped by the assumptions and expectations of the scientific theories we embrace. If we assume that nature is the product of a blind and accidental cause, then that's going to shape the questions we seek to nature, to ask nature. And those questions are going to limit what we actually discover. That's key. Nowhere is this more true than in the field of Darwinian evolution itself, which is based on the inviolable assumption that everything in biology must be the result of unguided material causes. Over the past century and a half, this assumption has undoubtedly inspired some interesting research questions. At the same time, it has also undoubtedly discouraged and delayed many other important research questions. Witness the unhelpful Darwinian preoccupation with vestigial organs over the past century. Time and again, biological features we do not fully understand have been dismissed prior to serious investigation by advocates of Darwinian evolution as non-functional leftovers from a blind evolutionary process. Time and again, also, researchers who eventually bothered to look discovered that such supposedly vestigial features, the appendix and tonsils to name two, actually perform important biological functions. The evidence of function was there all along. It was there in nature, but scientists were discouraged by the existing paradigm from asking the questions that would elicit the evidence. More recently, one of the biggest blunders in the history of modern biology may turn out to be the belief that the human genome is riddled, absolutely riddled with so-called junk DNA. Random mutations in the protein coding DNA are supposed to drive Darwinian evolution. So when it was discovered that the vast majority of DNA does not code for proteins, many leading Darwinists jumped to the conclusion that non-protein coding DNA must be mere junk, left over from the evolutionary process, just like some vestigial organ. Not only that, leading evolutionists such as Oxford University's Richard Dawkins championed junk DNA as proof positive that human beings were the result of an unguided material evolutionary process rather than intentional design. However, when scientists finally started to look closely at non-coding DNA, they were shocked. Reality did not correspond to their ideological Darwinist assumptions. Starting with the ENCODE project around 2007, there has been a flood, tidal wave of research showing that so-called junk DNA actually perform important biological functions. We don't have time to go into that, but because of these failures of the Darwinian paradigm, over the past few years, there have been a growing number of scientists who have become disillusioned with these failures. Robert Laughlin is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist at Stanford. He's gone so far as to declare evolution by natural selection has lately come to function more as an anti-theory, called upon to cover up embarrassing experimental shortcomings and legitimize findings that are at best questionable, and at worst, not even wrong. Russell Carlson is Emeritus Professor of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at the University of Georgia, one of America's top research universities. He says, science needs to be guided by objective evaluation of the evidence, and scientists should not allow their thinking to be arbitrarily restricted by dogmatic ideas. We need scientists who think outside the Darwinian box. And there are many more. We could talk about David Galerntner, who's a professor of computer science at Yale, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to say that. But it's not just individual scientists who are raising objections about traditional Darwinian theory. The Royal Society in the United Kingdom, one of the world's preeminent scientific societies, in 2016, they convened a conference to try to find a new theory of evolution because traditional Darwinian theory was failing to explain the major changes in the history of life. But not only are more scientists questioning Darwinian theory, a growing number are re-embracing the idea that yes, nature does reflect an intelligent design. Charles Townes is a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He chaired NASA's Science Advisory Committee for the Apollo moon landing program. In a 2005 interview, he declared, intelligent design, as one sees it from a scientific point of view, seems to be quite real. This is a very special universe. It's remarkable that it came out just this way. More recently, Brian Josephson is the winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics as well. He won it back in the 70s, but he's made this comment I'm going to cite just a couple of years ago. He's a fellow of the Royal Society in England, emeritus professor of physics at Cambridge, so he's no slouch. In 2021, he declared, far from being an unscientific claim, intelligent design is valid science. And we could go on and on about the scientists and scientific groups that now are coming to the conclusion that, that intelligent design is real and that that actually fits science. I personally think that the reason that intelligent design is gaining traction once again is because it helps us make sense of the growing number of things that just don't fit within a paradigm of unintelligent materialism. For example, we now know at the base of life is biological information. We see this in DNA, but also elsewhere. But DNA functions as a code directing many aspects of an organism's development, just like software. Codes and information systems are hallmarks of mind, of intelligent design, not an unguided accidental process. Intelligent design also helps us to understand why the universe, to quote Galileo, is written in mathematical language. The fact that we can understand the universe mathematically and even make predictions about the material world based on mathematics has been a vexing puzzle for the modern materialist. After all, why should there be such a correspondence between math, something non-material, and nature? To echo another Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Eugene Wigner, if one assumes a materialist conception of nature, it seems positively unreasonable for mathematics to be so effective in the natural sciences. But it's perfectly reasonable if one sees nature as reflecting intelligent design. Nature is mathematical because it reflects the mind of its maker. I think intelligent design also helps us better appreciate the nested layers of purpose in our universe. One of my friends and colleagues at Discovery Institute is biologist Michael Denton. Perhaps more than anyone else, he helped me understand how intelligent design isn't just found in complex biological adaptations like the molecular machines I talked about. It's also seen in the countless preconditions in nature, preconditions that are required for us and for our civilization to exist at all. One of the most wondrous examples is creatures and a planet where you can use fire. And I don't have time to go into this. There's a video, one of the many videos I've directed is called Fire Maker, and there's a short book by Denton on it. I would encourage you, if you really want to be wowed about something that is so amazing, it'll just blow your mind, I would refer you to that. Just in thumbnail, everyone agrees that the mastery of fire in our history was a change of civilization. The reason we can have metals, computers, basically everything that we're looking at is because humans mastered fire. But they never asked the question is, well, how did it come to be that we could master fire? And it turns out there is precondition upon precondition from the level of the universe down to our physical bodies, because in the known universe, there's actually only one creature that can actually master and use fire. You're looking at them. This is an amazing story, and most scientists or people who write about, oh, the amazing thing of fire, and the harnessing, that somehow it got harnessed, they don't actually realize all these givens that had to be in place, including enough ore in the crustal materials that you could actually smelt it out and then make it usable to build things like eyeglasses and everything else. So I'd encourage you to look at that video. It's just like 18 minutes long, or read his book. My point is that intelligence. Don't
forget bacon.
Bacon. Okay. Okay. Well, yes, cooked food. Cooked food is right. So intelligent design helps us make sense of the world as it actually exists, a world that exhibits evidence of foresight and planning by a master creator at every level of nature. As a result, a belief in design, which actually is something that the Bible teaches, provides a solid foundation for science. It also inspires us to do better science. And that's true whether you're an atheist or a Christian. For even scientists who think they reject the intelligent design of nature today are forced to treat nature as if it's intelligently designed to understand its inner workings. Now, in my last just few minutes, I want to sort of shift to one final way in which the Bible helps nurture science. It helps save science from itself. Science left to itself has no limits other than what you can do. As a result, the same science that produces wonder-working drugs and electricity, new medical treatments and computers, also brings forth biological weapons, atom bombs, poison gas, lobotomies, eugenics, scientific racism, and the abortion pill. A biblical worldview gives us a basis for constraining science so it leads to human flourishing rather than human destruction. The Bible teaches that humans have no right to play God, so not all things are permitted. The Bible proclaims that all human beings are created in the image of God, so every human should be treated accordingly. The Bible teaches that God planned us and knew us even in our mother's womb, therefore killing life in the womb is wrong. The Bible teaches we were created male and female, and so we should honor our bodies, not mutilate them. Because we Christians are supposed to know these truths, we have a special role to play in keeping science within the confines set by God and nature. Sadly, many leading Christians in our culture have not lived up to that responsibility. Some Christians who worry about the negative world urge that if only we had more Christians in power in our society, things would be different. In reality, we actually have lots of self-identified Christians in government, law, entertainment, and even science. The problem is they are what I call Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. And here's my plug for my book that will be coming out. They identify more with anti-Christian elites than with their own brothers and sisters in Christ. So their faith is neutered. Like I said, I go into that in my upcoming book. I'll just leave you with one example from the world of science. His name is Francis Collins. How many of you have heard of Francis Collins? Collins is probably the most celebrated, influential scientist in America today who identifies as an evangelical Christian. In his past roles as the head of the NIH and as acting science advisor to President Biden, Collins was surely one of the most powerful scientists in our nation. Unfortunately, his public record was not very different from that of a secular materialist. He campaigned against Christian scientists who think biology shows evidence of intelligent design. He even advocated the junk DNA paradigm before it was overturned. But far worse was his refusal to support proper limits on science. During his tenure in the government, the agency he headed spent millions of dollars to fund the harvesting of tissues from aborted babies for medical experiment, babies up to 40 weeks in gestation. His agency also funded gruesome experiments that involved slicing off the scalp of aborted babies and then grafting the fetal skin onto mice to create mice-human hybrids. And his agency funded the use of puberty blockers and gender-destructive surgeries to mutilate children. Collins himself personally urged the employees of his agency to become what he called allies of the LGBTQIA movement. If you were an employee of his, you had to be an ally. And he said he was an ally. Collins also chair-led punitive mandates on many Christians of good conscience who disagreed with him about the COVID vaccination after publicly promising that there would be no mandates. And he's never apologized. If we want Christians to bring light to the negative world, including the world of science, I would argue we need to raise up Christians who actually embrace God's light and aren't afraid to uphold it. In Matthew 5:14-15, and this was referred to by an earlier speaker, it's a great thing to ponder from this conference. Jesus tells his disciples, "You are the light of the world." Of course, Jesus is the light of the world, but he was saying, you are also the light of the world if you follow me. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. If we want our culture to be enlightened, we are called to place the lamp of biblical truth on a stand for all to see, including the world of science. Thank you.